Chicago, Illinois, March 16, 1959. Albert Francis Capone walked into Cook County Criminal Court carrying a briefcase that contained everything he'd need to defend a man that everyone, including the judge, the prosecutor, and probably half the jury, had already decided was guilty. Albert was 30 years old, had been practicing law for just 3 years, and was about to take on a case that more experienced attorneys had refused to touch, because defending a Negro man accused of assaulting a white police officer in 1959 Chicago was professional suicide and everyone knew it. But Albert Francis Capone wasn't just any lawyer. He was the son of Al Capone, the son of the most famous gangster in American history, the man who could have inherited an empire of organized crime, but who'd chosen instead to become the one thing his father had spent a lifetime avoiding: someone who believed the law mattered. If you're watching this story about the day Al Capone's son destroyed racism in a Chicago courtroom, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. And subscribe so you never miss the stories that show how one person's choice can change everything. Your engagement helps this story reach people who need to hear it. The man Albert was defending was named Thomas Washington, 28 years old, worked as a mechanic at a South Side garage, had a wife and 2 young children, had never been arrested before, had no criminal record, was exactly the kind of person who should never have been sitting in a courtroom, facing 20 years in prison. But on February 3rd, 1959, Thomas Washington had made the mistake of being black and being in the wrong place when 2 white Chicago police officers needed someone to blame for a crime that hadn't actually happened the way they'd reported it. The official story, according to officers Patrick Murphy and James Sullivan, was simple. They'd responded to a disturbance call at a Southside bar. When they arrived, they'd attempted to question Thomas Washington, who they claimed was intoxicated and aggressive. Washington had allegedly attacked Officer Murphy without provocation, punching him twice before Officer Sullivan subdued Washington with his nightstick. Murphy had a black eye and a split lip to prove the assault had occurred. Both officers had filed detailed reports. The prosecutor had charged Washington with assault on a police officer and resisting arrest, and the case seemed straightforward enough that Washington's court-appointed attorney had advised him to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence. But Washington insisted he was innocent, said he hadn't been drinking, said he hadn't attacked anyone, said the officers had beaten him for no reason and then arrested him to justify the beating, said he had witnesses who'd seen everything. Nobody believed him. Why would they? It was his word against 2 police officers. And in 1959 Chicago, a Negro man's word meant nothing when white cops said otherwise. Washington had fired his court-appointed attorney after the man refused to actually investigate the case or call any witnesses. For 2 weeks, Washington had sat in Cook County Jail with no legal representation and no hope because nobody would take his case. Until Albert Francis Capone walked into that jail cell and said 5 words that changed everything. "I believe you. I'll help." Albert had heard about Washington's case through a contact at the public defender's office who knew that Albert sometimes took cases other lawyers wouldn't touch, cases involving poor clients who'd been told the system didn't work for people like them, clients who needed someone willing to fight. And Albert Francis Capone, despite carrying a name that meant organized crime and violence and corruption to everyone who heard it, had built his entire legal career around one principle: the law should protect everyone, not just white people, not just wealthy people, everyone. He'd heard that principle from his father, ironically. Al Capone had died when Albert was 19. But before his death, weakened by syphilis and years of imprisonment, Al Capone had told his son something that Albert never forgot. "I built power the wrong way," Capone had said. "I broke laws instead of using them. But laws, real laws that apply equally to everyone, those are more powerful than any gang. You be the thing I couldn't be. You make the law mean something." So Albert had become a lawyer, had gone to law school despite classmates who whispered about his father, had passed the bar despite firms that wouldn't interview him because of his last name, had opened his own practice because nobody would hire Al Capone's son. And now, in March 1959, He was about to walk into a Chicago courtroom and try to convince an all-white jury that two police officers were lying and that a Negro mechanic was telling the truth. The trial began on March 16th. Judge Richard Morrison presiding, a man known for being tough on crime and sympathetic to police, a man who'd made his career sending criminals to prison and who wasn't particularly interested in defense attorneys who claimed police misconduct. Morrison looked at Albert when he entered the courtroom, did a visible double take when he read the name on the defense filing, leaned forward and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mr. Capone. Any relation to the Al Capone?" "Mm-mm. Yes, Your Honor," Albert replied calmly. "He was my father." The courtroom went silent. Jurors whispered to each other. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Chen, smiled like he'd just been handed an easy victory. Because how could a jury take seriously a defense from the son of America's most notorious criminal? This is where Albert Francis Capone shows why choosing your own path matters more than the legacy you're given. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe. Because what he does next proves that one man can stand against an entire system. Every comment and subscription helps more people discover these untold stories. Albert's opening statement was unlike anything the courtroom had heard before. He didn't apologize for his father, didn't distance himself from the Capone name. Instead, he used it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Albert began, speaking directly to the 12 white faces who would decide Thomas Washington's fate. "My name is Albert Francis Capone. My father was Al Capone, the gangster, the criminal, the man who broke laws and hurt people and built an empire on violence. I know what you're thinking. How can the son of Al Capone stand here and talk about justice? How can someone with my last name defend anyone in a court of law? Here's how. Because I learned from my father's mistakes. Because I watched what happens when people decide the law doesn't apply to them. When they decide might makes right. When they decide that someone who's powerless doesn't deserve protection. My father lived above the law. These two police officers," Albert said, pointing at Murphy and Sullivan, "think they live above it too. They think they can beat a man, arrest him to cover up the beating, lie about what happened, and face no consequences because they have badges, and Thomas Washington is black. They're wrong, and I'm going to prove it." The prosecutor's case was straightforward. Officer Murphy testified about responding to the disturbance call, about trying to question Washington, about being attacked without warning. Officer Sullivan corroborated every detail. Both officers were confident, professional, and convincing. Then Albert cross-examined them, and everything changed. "Officer Murphy," Albert said quietly, approaching the witness stand, "you testify that Mr. Washington punched you twice, once in the eye, once in the mouth. Is that correct?" "Yes," Murphy replied. "And you filed a report immediately after the incident, describing the assault in detail?" "Yes." Albert pulled out a document. "This is your report. Filed at 11:47 p.m. on February 3rd. It says, and I quote, 'Suspect struck me with closed fist, right hand, connecting with my left eye and lower lip.'" "That's correct," Murphy confirmed. Albert walked to the evidence table, picked up a photograph. "This is a photo of your injuries, taken the next morning at the hospital. Is this accurate?" Murphy looked at the photo, hesitated. "Yes." Albert held up the photograph for the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you can see Officer Murphy's black eye, his split lip. Clear evidence he was struck. The question is, by whom?" He turned back to Murphy. "Officer, you're right-handed, correct?" "Yes." "So when you wrote in your report that the suspect struck you with his right hand, you were describing someone facing you, using their right hand to punch your left side. That's correct." Albert placed the photograph in front of Murphy. "Then why, Officer Murphy, is your black eye on your right side? Why is the injury to the right side of your lip? If Thomas Washington, a right-handed man standing in front of you, punched you with his right hand, the impact would be on your left side, but your injuries are on your right." The courtroom went silent. Murphy's face went pale. Unless Albert continued, you weren't punched by someone standing in front of you. Unless someone standing to your right struck you. Someone like your partner, Officer Sullivan, who was also right-handed and who was standing to your right when this alleged assault occurred. Objection. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said, but his voice was less certain than before. Albert called Thomas Washington to the stand. Washington told a story. How he'd been at the bar having coffee, not drinking. How the officers had entered looking for someone else. How they grabbed him, demanded ID, and when he'd asked why, Officer Sullivan had hit him with a nightstick. How Murphy had tried to stop Sullivan but had been accidentally struck. How both officers had then beaten Washington and arrested him to justify the violence. Then Albert called 4 witnesses, people who'd been at the bar that night. All of them black, all of them terrified to testify against police officers, but all of them telling the same story. Washington wasn't drinking, wasn't aggressive. The officers had attacked him. Murphy had been struck accidentally by his own partner. Everything Washington said was true. The prosecutor tried to discredit them. Suggested they were lying to protect Washington. Suggested their testimony couldn't be trusted because they were colored and had reason to dislike police. But Albert's closing argument destroyed that narrative. The prosecutor wants you to believe, Albert told the jury, that 4 witnesses are lying to protect Thomas Washington. That they've all coordinated their stories. That they've all risked perjury charges to help a man they barely knew. But consider this. If they were lying, wouldn't they have gotten their story straight? Wouldn't they have agreed on every detail? Instead, their testimonies differ in small ways. Different perspectives. Different memories. The way real witnesses remember real events. Officer Murphy and Officer Sullivan, their testimonies match perfectly. Word for word. Because they wrote reports together. Because they coordinated their lies. And the physical evidence? The injuries on the wrong side of Officer Murphy's face? That's not speculation. That's science. That's physics. That's physics. That's proof that what they testified to couldn't have happened the way they described. Ladies and gentlemen, my father was a criminal. He hurt people. He broke laws. And he got away with it for years because people were afraid to stand up to him. Because the system protected him. Because power mattered more than truth. Don't let that happen here. Don't let these officers get away with beating a man and then lying about it because they have badges and Thomas Washington is black. Don't let power matter more than truth. Before we finish the story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. And subscribe because justice sometimes requires one person to stand up and say no. Your support helps us keep bringing these hidden histories to light. The jury deliberated for 7 hours, longer than anyone expected for what should have been a simple case. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Not guilty on all charges. Thomas Washington walked free. The charges were dismissed. And 3 months later, after an internal investigation triggered by Albert's courtroom evidence, both officers Murphy and Sullivan were fired from the Chicago Police Department. Albert Francis Capone continued practicing law until his death in 2004 at age 75. Over 45 years, he defended hundreds of clients that other lawyers wouldn't touch. He never became wealthy, never became famous, never escaped his father's shadow completely. But everyone he defended remembered him, remembered the lawyer who'd chosen justice over his father's empire, who'd used the law to protect people instead of breaking it to gain power. That's the story of March 1959, the day Al Capone's son walked into a Chicago courtroom and proved that legacies aren't inherited, they're chosen. The day a name that meant crime and violence and corruption became associated with justice and courage, and standing up for someone who had no power. Because Albert Francis Capone understood something his father never did. That real power doesn't come from fear. It comes from doing what's right even when it's hard. even when everyone expects you to fail, even when your last name makes people assume you're the villain. Al Capone built an empire on breaking laws. His son spent a lifetime proving that laws, when used correctly, are more powerful than any empire. And sometimes the best way to honor your father is to be everything he couldn't.